we just can't help being, I don't know, sitting down with a cup of tea and talking about these things.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Unitarian Christian Alliance Podcast, Episode 16, Bible Feed Podcast, with guests Dan Weatherall and Paul Davenport. I'm Mark Kane. Welcome to the second Get to Know the Folks Behind a Unitarian Christian Podcast episode. The first was Episode 9, the Biblical Unitarian Podcast with Dustin Smith. Today we spin the globe and stop it on the UK to meet two British gentlemen who host Bible Feed. We also get some listener feedback on both ends of the interview. Yeah, a smorgasbord today.
Hi, Mark. I'm from Paducah, Kentucky. My name is Lisa Truitt. I really appreciate your work doing interviews, and especially the recent one with Kevin George. It confirmed what I've always suspected, that a lot of scholars know that Jesus is not God and that the Trinity is false, but for various reasons hide the truth and continue to promote these Antichrist doctrines. It really wasn't surprising that Fred Sanders admits they are false and knowingly proposed a scheme for continuing the deception. Several months ago, a friend, a young woman in our church, told me that her brother went to seminary and witnessed the same thing. Theologians there essentially admitting the same things Fred Sanders said, but agreeing that they would keep it to themselves within their inner circle to avoid persecution and the destruction of their careers. What Fred Sanders is doing makes me think of the scriptures in 1st and 2nd John talking about many deceivers that have gone out into the world denying that Jesus is the human Son of God. People who know better and deliberately protect and promote a lie are the highest level of deceiver there is. I plan on getting Fred's book so that I can show people that they are being lied to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Fred may get a few extra book sales from these episodes, but when there's a great Unitarian resource out there like this, it's hard to pass it up. Kevin George posted a 2-part YouTube series reviewing Fred Sanders' book, The Triune God, several years back. I'll put links to those videos in the show notes. George's thoughts may help serve as a guide to all the wonders that Fred packed into his book. Hey, that's an idea. Maybe we could contact the publisher and try to purchase the rights. We could make an annotated Unitarian study edition of The Triune God. Lisa, I feel it appropriate to warn you. You may become enamored with his erudite use of words. It is impressive. It's alluring. Imagine what you could do with that skill. You could take virtually any poor theory and present it quite spectacularly. It is tempting. I have the book. I started losing track of his actual points and was using it more as a guide of how to never talk or write. And I didn't make it through. If you think I'm being mean, and if you haven't read it, please reserve judgment until you do. I can't even imagine a Trinitarian enjoying it, honestly, especially the parts where he admits to the scriptural proofs for the Trinity no longer carrying much weight. Many of our guests have discovered in various ways and at various times in their life that the scriptures taught something other than what they had grown up believing. Our guests today, Dan Weatherall and Paul Davenport, they grew up in the Christadelphian movement. We'll learn a little about that, about them, and their podcast. Dan and Paul, welcome to the UCA podcast.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark.
Dan Weatherall, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, me, I'm a Christadelphian. I live in the UK Midlands, so North Warwickshire, right in the middle of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a Christadelphian all my life. And the rest of me, I'm a surveyor. And I live here with my wife and children. So, fairly ordinary person.
All right. Paul Davenport.
Okay, so hi, Mark. I'm 52 years old, which means I am very close to getting my vaccination. So I've been a Christadelphian since I was 16.
Okay.
I'm a second generation Christadelphian, I suppose. My father was at university when he kind of came across something written by one of the early Christadelphian sort of founders and really thought it clicked and it made sense. I've got 2 children, a little bit older than Dan's.
Dan, did you give us your age?
Yeah, 34.
Okay.
So yeah, there's quite a gap, really, isn't there, Paul?
Yeah.
Well, let's cover what a Christadelphian is so that listeners in different parts of the world get a chance to learn.
Yeah, so the Christadelphian movement came out of the 1800s in the UK and the US. There's quite a few different movements at the time that sort of were all about restoring the faith of the apostles. And so we're a global church community from the UK to South Africa, in the US, China, Mexico, Malawi, India and the Philippines, and
wow,
yeah, Russia, New Zealand. I've forgotten the Australians, but they won't mind that. I'm sure.
No, not at all.
No. So, we're all over the place.
Okay.
And we are biblical Unitarians. So we believe in one God, the Father, and the human Son, Jesus, who was born of Mary by the power of God. He's God's Son, the Son of God.
Yeah.
So,
it was a couple of the defining features of Christadelphians. Right from those early days, it was all about, well, let's look at the Bible ourselves and understand what it's saying, rather than relying on what a clergy is telling you.
Yeah.
And that's always been a defining feature. And so we're a lay community. So we don't have a full-time clergy or ministry. And that means there's a very heavy emphasis on people learning for themselves. Do your own reading. It's more by accident than anything else. We've ended up with a reading plan that probably 3/4 of the community globally are using the same Bible reading plan for each day. So quite often you get this wonderful connection wherever you are in the world. I remember when I was traveling on business, I could find some local Christadelphians, spend the evening with them, and they'd be at the same place in the kind of reading plan.
Oh, that's cool.
And you just sit down and read the 2 or 3 chapters for that day, and you're kind of right there with them.
Is that an annual plan, like you would get through the whole Bible in a year, or is it something similar to that?
Yeah, it's sort of 2 portions from the Old Testament, 1 from the New Testament. So you end up reading through the Old Testament and the New Testament twice in a year.
Okay. I
actually, having used that plan for many years, tend not to use it so much now. I find that often it's good to just, let's look at a book and kind of read it right through.
I see.
And it gives you a different perspective.
Yeah.
It's a good illustration of the focus on individuals all, learning themselves. It's a good way of sort of promoting that feature of the community, I think. The emphasis on everyone, trying to understand for themselves and own these things puts a lot of pressure on everyone, because we're all sort of normal people trying to keep down a job, and we're all running churches left, right, and centre at the same time as well. But keeps us busy.
Yeah, and even though there are obviously some downsides to that self-learning approach, what checks and balances are there on the interpretations that different individuals come up with?
Yeah,
I guess we're still doing that within a framework of foundational beliefs.
Yeah. Is there a pastor or a pastoral role, or is it elders in a typical Christadelphian church?
Typically, as far as I know, you wouldn't find a pastor. You'd find an arranging committee.
Okay.
Who effectively would be the elders. And I think some Christadelphian churches call their arranging committee elders.
Okay.
But even then, pretty much everything would then be presented to the rest of the church. And, all members pretty much get a say on everything. That's is pretty much a flat structure. I mean, we're speaking of our own experience.
Yeah.
And of course, there's, 60,000 Christadelphians around the world. So there's bound to be variation on that.
Fair.
There'll be some churches that the arranging committee take a bit more control, maybe, and others that it's extremely sort of flat structure. But
yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that, each congregation is a collection of human beings with all their flaws and foibles. So, it works as you'd expect any other gathering of human beings to work. And, sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. But it does provide, I think, about the right balance, and it provides a framework in which anyone with their different skill or talent can find their place and find their thing to contribute. I think it does lead to a membership generally, which is very committed to the community.
I like that.
Yeah. We've got that shared basis of fellowship around belief in one God and the various other fundamentals around that. And the rest of it is built up mutually and cooperatively, really.
Some of the previous guests that I've had have described the challenges that they faced being in a Sunday school class or just a classroom setting and deciding to raise their hand and ask questions because maybe they heard something that they didn't think was true. And it's a very common theme in these stories is that the teacher or the others in the class or the pastor of a church does not appreciate that kind of questioning. So it seems like, just from what you said so far, that is a different model in your church, that somebody having a difficult question would be more welcome to ask that question?
Yeah. One of the things that we've done in the past is put on sort of very much educating focused seminars.
Okay.
So come and learn to read the Bible effectively, almost outside of a religious context. Come and just be educated. You get people coming along and you work through at sort of foundation level. I don't know, weeks 4, 5, 6, you might have started to introduce the fact that Jesus isn't actually God. He's, presented as the Son of God and the man appointed by God and approved by his miracles, wonders and signs. And we've had lots of diversity of views when we've run those things before. I think probably by doing it that way, you're enjoying the collective learning experience anyway, and people are enjoying it. So it's never, ever seen as a confrontational sort of thing.
Yeah, there's probably two different contexts in which that questioning and learning happens. One is the sort of situation that Dan's just described, which is us inviting the public who may have a background in a very different Christian tradition or may not have any Christian background at all. And in that sort of scenario, yes, you have to be prepared to just deal with all sorts of questions and ideas that come up. Obviously we'll be looking from a scriptural point of view at a Unitarian position. And so often if somebody just can't accept that is a valid approach, then, we'll shake hands and move on.
Yeah.
But then there's, the kind of learning, once you're kind of part of our community, whoever's become part of our community will have already got to the point where the Unitarian view is solidly accepted.
I see.
And that won't be the kind of thing that they'll be putting their hand up and saying, hang on.
Very cool. It's a nice model. I see a lot of positive to that kind of a model. I had Kevin George in an earlier podcast whose experience was with very authoritarian individuals at the head of the church, and that experience did not go very well. It tends to, I'd say, tempt the worst in us to be in that position. It tempts the people who like power or like leadership into things that maybe ultimately is not healthy for them or for the church. So good job on having a structure that protects that kind of a problem to some degree.
Yeah, to some degree. We're all human, aren't we, at the end of the day?
Yeah.
So there's humans are humans, wherever you find them. But yeah, I listened to those episodes that you just referred to. Yeah, they're really fascinating to me because it's so different from my experience. And it's really, really interesting.
All right. So you guys have a podcast called Bible Feed, and you have 19 episodes so far. I'd like to hear a little bit of the backstory of how you ended up making a podcast.
By accident. So I started it off maybe a year or so before we actually had a podcast, just as a way of trying to collect good content that was, produced by our community online and try and distribute it further.
Okay.
Just to try and get the word out, really, of the gospel and the good news about Jesus. So that was kind of the intention. But Paul came along and he's always wanted to do a podcast, so tagged it on. To be honest, it's gone really well. So it came out of the first lockdown, didn't it, really?
Yeah. So with Dan's Bible feed sort of hub of material, I sort of jumped on that and thought I can use this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd always had this thought that because of the lay community that we've described, we have quite a number of people that are able to present and talk coherently about what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
And, you listen to other podcasts and you think, well, yeah, we've got good people with good things to say that we could use that medium of communication. It's a very effective, engaging way of communicating. Never really got it started until lockdown happened. And then you think, well, we can't do our normal public events in a local hall. So what do? We've got to do something online. Well, let's start doing the podcast. And so it was just a case of, it was just something, a change in circumstances, which just spurred us to actually do something different. And here we are.
Why the name Bible Feed? What does that come from?
So it comes from being a constant feed of good quality material talking about the Bible, really. So we wanted it to be a constant aggregator of good stuff that people want to hear. So what do they want in their feed? They want Bible stuff. Then they come to Bible Feed.
It's logical.
That's it, really.
Yes.
It's very simple. Yeah.
And it has that lovely double meaning of feeding on the milk of the word or the meat of the word, whichever you're looking for.
Yeah. We've not played on that yet, have we? I don't know whether we might do at some point.
Yeah. Now, did you know each other long before you started the podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah, we go to the same Christadelphian church in the Midlands, yeah.
So do you see your podcast as more similar to what you described earlier, that kind of outward-facing public gathering to just learn about the Bible? Or is it a little more of what you would expect internally, like after somebody's already joined your organization, to get kind of the more deeper internal stuff?
I would say probably more of the first, but actually having the conversation with people is really good rather than just one person sort of presenting on monologues. I mean, there's a place for that, definitely, and there's good podcasts that do that, but I feel like we're able to connect a bit more with topics and present good things in an accessible kind of way. Yeah. There's people in our community who have been in our community all their life who I know are listening and they're finding it really helpful. So that's great. There's also people who are not believers at all who are listening, and that's kind of what we want. So it's great.
What kind of question might somebody be asking for which your podcast would be an ideal tool for them?
I suppose there's lots of different questions that people could be asking because we're covering lots of varied topics, really, I suppose. Things like, what does the Bible teach about human nature and how does that relate to Jesus? So we've had an episode about human nature from someone who is a professional trained counsellor, who's Christadelphian. He led us through some really good stuff on that. Questions which are sometimes challenging to faith, like how should we sort of think through the Bible and history? Differences between the Gospels, what do we make of those? So
yeah, I mean that's sort of the broader question of why is the text of the Bible the way it is, and what does that mean about how you approach it? It is complex. It can be confusing. Questions like why are there multiple Gospels that record different episodes, different things in different ways? What is prophecy? How should you approach prophetic texts and read them responsibly and respectfully? But broader than that, I think what we're trying to demonstrate is, what does a living faith look like in ordinary people? Because we're not scholars, that I think is kind of what comes across, which means we don't have all the answers.
Right. I appreciate that style in what you do. It's part of what makes a comfortable or a relaxing exploration of scriptures welcoming for outsiders. I think that contributes to the feel of your podcast.
Yeah. With one eye on scholarship, I think it's probably fair to say. We're not about going way off piste and just coming up with our own weird and wacko ideas. That's, grounded. What's our podcast jingle, Paul? Bible Feed's a place for conversations.
Place for conversations about faith in the modern world where ordinary people come together to understand the Bible better.
There you go, yeah.
That does mean, while we're not scholars, that doesn't mean we are not open to using scholarship.
Yeah.
It is what we use all the time to assess and interpret and read and understand.
Yeah. When I listen to it, I feel like I'm sitting at the table listening to you just talk about the topic at hand. Was that something you did on purpose, or it's just the way you guys are?
Yeah, I think we did set out to create a conversation, but that was coming from the point of view of, well, if we're going to produce material that is suitable and relevant and engaging for someone who's not part of our community, they're going to have questions about an issue. It was just a good way of presenting an idea and then asking a question about it and looking at it from a different point of view.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are a lot of people who appreciate it because it's, again, like I said, it's relaxed, it's thoughtful, and you guys are you're the English. What is the phrase?
We're British and we're not, in your face Americans, or that's what you're trying to say.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. Yeah, I listen to lots of different podcasts, and I've listened to quite a few, the Unitarian, yours and others as well. And they're all great. But it has made me realize how British I am, which I have no personal sort of nationalism or patriotism at all. But yeah, we just can't help being, I don't know, sitting down with a cup of tea and talking about these things, basically.
Yeah. Initially, anyway, I don't think we set out to be a Unitarian podcast.
No.
It was just we want to help people understand the gospel and see the narrative of the Bible and get to grips with it and make it meaningful and relevant in life.
Right.
While yes, we might poke at the Unitarian Trinitarian issue a few times. Part of what we want to do is actually show that the Unitarian view fits in a broad and deep understanding of what it means to be a Christian and live as a Christian.
Yeah, yours is a Unitarian podcast simply because that's one of your views. Dale Tuggy's Trinities podcast is all about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The UCA podcast orbits that topic entirely. Whereas yours, or like Sean Finnegan's podcast, I expect you to probably go in many directions over the coming year.
We've got a lot of material.
We have no idea
yeah.
what direction we'll go.
Yeah. There's lots of ways we could go. The Bible's a big book, isn't it? So
yes, it is.
Yeah.
Do you have any vision for a year or 2 or 3 years down the road? I'm curious.
Only so far as making sure Paul does a Revelation series, because that will be really, really good. I think keep going is what we want to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like 19, 20 episodes in, we've just about got ourselves established as we kind of just know what we're doing in bringing 2 people or 3 people together to have a conversation around a topic that kind of heads in a direction, has a start, beginning, and end. And we've just got to that point where it's starting to be noticed. And I think as we develop a year, 2 years from now, it'll be about promoting it and then probably adding a few different features, maybe some online course content.
Oh, very nice. You actually did recently start the topic of the Trinity. So this is actually pretty good timing that we would mention this on the Unitarian Christian Alliance podcast. How long do you think that topic is going to go before you move on to another topic?
It's probably going to be there, not every episode, but it's going to keep coming back, I think. So at the same time, we're running a series on Matthew as well. So every other episode is that.
So we've done one which sort of introduced what some of the key questions are in thinking about Trinity versus Unitarian view. And then we've done this one on the pre-existence. We'll probably have another one fairly soon, which may be a bit more of a Q&A with a guy called Tom Gaston, who's done quite a lot of research and doctoral studies on the topic.
Okay.
But then I think it will just pop up periodically after that.
What's one of your favorite aspects of doing a podcast?
It forces you to really think about what you're saying, which is great because you're basically putting forward your thoughts sending it out to the world, you've got to be quite sure of what you're saying. So it really does force you to think things through, to try and compress things down into the key. What's the real thing I want to get across here? Mm-hmm. I've talked about the series on Matthew. That's one that I'm sort of going through. Mm-hmm. How do you get across some of the really key and exciting things about the Gospel of Matthew in 40 minutes or whatever, over a course of about 6 episodes? Mm. I think it develops you while you're doing it. So I found that really helpful, actually.
Yeah, and I think that process of wanting to put something out which doesn't just present one point of view, but also acknowledges the existence of other points of view and asks that question and responds to it. Putting yourself briefly into the other person's shoes and thinking about issues from a different point of view. The other thing I really enjoyed, actually, is we deliberately set it up with a little peer review group. So that when we put together an outline, then we let a group of 7 or 8 people from different parts of the world look through it and just make sure it makes sense and we're not using jargon that people aren't going to understand and it's relevant. And that's been really enjoyable to do it that way.
Wow.
And then also, Paul, you like finding the music, don't you? For
this is a very important part.
Which I noticed, Mark, you don't really introduce music into yours, do you? But
no.
One thing I've been very envious of is your sound effects that you've incorporated, which I'm wondering if you might sort of put my voice in an echo chamber for part of this episode. If you can work that for me.
I could work something out. Well, if you ever have a moment during the episode where you're thinking something to yourself in your head, just wave your hand at me.
Good.
I'll turn it. You say it out loud, and it will sound like you're thinking it in your head. If I can do that,
that's good.
I agree with your point about thinking about what you're saying. I've always enjoyed the aspects of life which involve restrictions, narrowing the scope of something to a point where it seems like it's going to be a limitation, and then rising to meet the challenge of that limitation. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about podcasts is as I'm putting together content, I think, is that going to be understood? Can I make that more clear? And it's the constraint of being restricted to audio that I feel is the very challenge I need to push beyond and see, can it be done?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Sometimes it's an advantage not to see my face. So.
That's good. Although we do put that out there, don't we?
Yeah.
Because we record video as well, and we take little snippets of the video and post them to the Facebook page and circulate that round as little promotional things. Exciting. So that people can hear about the podcast.
You're only 19 episodes in, so a question like what has been your favorite series or what has been, some of the highlights of your experience so far, you're really still pretty new, but is there something that has brought you joy from what you've done so far?
Yeah, there's things like, someone's messaged me to say, they've just found it. They've listened to 7 episodes straight in a row while they've been decorating, which is great because, we're obviously doing something right. People are listening to us and they're not just switching off after 10 minutes. They're listening to 7. I don't yeah. I'm not sure I would do that.
I was just going to say, yeah. That it's a very encouraging thing. I've heard that only about 1% of a typical podcast audience ever interacts with the host. It's probably different for every style of podcast. If you have a close community and you know the people, you can probably get a little bit more. But, you hear from a couple people a week, that probably means quite a few people are benefiting from it. So maybe that's an encouragement. But that fella who listened for straight through, that's wonderful. With all the content that we have now, there's just a lot of stuff that people can expose themselves to. That's my dream, that everybody becomes as much interested in podcasts as I am, but I know that's kind of a dream.
Well, they're so good. They're just on demand, aren't they? People can just choose what they want to hear, which is perfect. So, the thing we're trying to do is produce stuff that people want to hear, I suppose.
Yeah. So you guys have been, I take it that you've been listening to podcasts and audio content for a long time for you to even think, let's do this ourselves. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and partly, particularly listening to Christian and Bible study related podcasts, you start to realize how much in the general Christian world there are people asking questions and exploring and perhaps deconstructing whatever Christian tradition they've been brought up with or accepted, and then looking for their own answers and looking to own their own faith. And in that context, you see people quite openly talking about resurrection as the hope rather than the immortal soul and heaven going. And you think, well, it's only one step removed from getting into the aspect of who is God and who is the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
We can put a voice into that environment and be relevant.
One thing I hope we can contribute is be the sort of Bible study podcast that has Unitarianism sitting behind it. I'm sure you do, many people do, listen along to Bible podcasts that can be really good, but, every now and then they throw in the Trinitarian stuff. It feels like they're sort of feeling compelled that they have to just throw it in, which, it leaves you with that kind of bitter taste in your mouth.
Yeah.
What we are is biblical Unitarians, so you won't get the kind of token appreciation for Father, Son, Spirit as one at the end.
Yeah. So if somebody wanted to reach out and contact you, email you something, what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, so the best thing is probably to go to the website, which is biblefeed.org, and there's a contact form there, or you can email info@biblefeed.org.
All right.
But yeah, all the resources that we've got are on the website. And then, of course, the podcast itself, you can either listen to it on the website or in any podcast player.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, guys. Paul and Dan, it's a pleasure to have met you in person now, not just through the podcast player on my device. And I really appreciate it.
It's been really good. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
So, as you may know, I had delayed episode 15 to do a self-check. And I let listeners know of the delay via Twitter @UCA Podcast and the UCA Podcast email list. It was a time to think about objectives and direction. It was related to a critical but thoughtful email I had read and responded to in an even earlier episode. During my quiet week, I got this email. Hey, Mark, I tend to agree with you that the UCA podcast doesn't have to be everything to everyone. It just can't, so there's no need to trouble yourself about it. It serves an important purpose. Its snarkiness is encouraging to a whole mass of people who feel like we're living in caves, like we're being hunted by the opposition. And your guests are really nice. You make a delightful, humorous contrast to them. I'm supportive of your introspection. It's worth it. But I think the podcast is encouraging a group, whose theological lives may be filled with drama and resentment, to chill out, to be lighthearted about this belief we have that excludes us from church. And that's what the UCA is about. It's not about trying to get Trinitarians to change their minds. Plenty of people are already doing that important work. The UCA says, "We see you, Unitarian, and we are with you." Keep up the good work, Mark. Laugh hard. Encourage us. We need it. In Christ, Anna Brown. Well, thanks, Anna. During my introspection time, I received other encouraging feedback too, like this short note from Jonathan. I don't have the courage to do what you do, so I figure I can at least cheer you on. As I've said before, I really enjoy your podcast. It's one I didn't know I needed. There are a lot of other people living quiet, obscure lives, maneuvering through tense family situations, meeting with elders and pastors, basically very stressed. If nothing else, my style and humor have expressed things that many have felt and wanted to say, but they've had no means to. This podcast is about living as a lowercase u Unitarian in a Trinitarian majority world. My guests are all doing this. We get a glimpse into their lives and appreciate their struggles, delight at their discoveries and their accomplishments. We get to see life outside our own small circle. I'm just one among millions of lowercase u people. And when I'm sharing my thoughts, you are getting yet another glimpse into yet one more of us curious creatures. As it turns out, when I share, it's a bit different, odd, encouraging, and fun most of the time. As a courtesy, I will typically have thoughts for our Trinitarian visitors. Despite my real audience, which is admittedly the choir, the vast Unitarian Christian choir, the content I share will have a broader reach, and I'm aware of that. I believe part of its appeal is that it isn't specifically designed for them. They get to experience it as a fly on the wall. They get to listen in to our conversations. They get to peer into the hearts and motivations of people who have given up so much because of their commitment to scriptural truth. They may even, perhaps, come to appreciate that what they've been told about non-Trinitarians is not like what they actually get when they meet us and take the time to listen. Hard to know what the future holds, but I suspect Dan and Sharon Gill were onto something when they named their site 21st Century Reformation, Episode 7. You and I and the whole of the UCA, we're kind of in the front row seats. If you have others who you know could use a bit of perspective broadening, maybe a moment to step back and look across the globe, maybe some long overdue encouragement, point them our way. I'd love to make their acquaintance. Follow us on Twitter at UCA Podcast. Catch the highlight reel of excellent quotes by following our Instagram, uca.podcast. And now you can be one of the Heresy Insiders by signing up for the email list. You'll get a little extra each episode, from additional thoughts, musings, to large episode artwork, which sometimes has subtle humor or just some visual pleasantries. I'm super in love with audio feedback. We have a nice record button on our podcast page, podcast.unitarianchristianalliance.org, and I put a link also in the show notes. You are welcome to use the phone line too, like Lisa did at the start of the show, 615-581-1158. You can let me know anything from, I'm here in Bangladesh and I appreciate the podcast, to, hey, what's the deal with whatever. I'll sneak these bits into each episode. Remember, there are many in the UCA who have very little fellowship. Let them know you're out there. Dan and Paul, I had such a delightful time chatting with you. We wish you great success with your Bible Feed podcast. If you do listen to their podcast and have any thoughts, let them know. Mention you found out about them here. They gave up some of their time to let me interview them. It would be encouraging to see results. And if you live in the UK and thought, what, there are others here? Then perhaps you hadn't signed up yet to the UCA directory. The website, UnitarianChristianAlliance.org, was designed to help people connect by creating a locality-based directory for individuals and groups. That membership tool is central to our mission of connecting people. If you need help, check out the 2 delightfully narrated videos, one for member sign-up and one for group creation. They're in the About menu under Help. Oh, Dan, there's likely to actually be music in an episode very soon, but not typical podcast music. May God bless you in your truth pursuits. I hope this podcast serves you well. The Trinity is not really biblical.
The Trinity is not really biblical.
You're trying to make sure you're faithful to the Word.
We're trying to make sure we are faithful to the Word.
You can go about being normal.
We're normal people. Normal people